type of reality, augmented, mixed, and virtual, where we are today and what we're going to be working on in the future. So, as I mentioned, I work on Unity on the Labs team. It seems like most of you have heard of it, but for those of you who do not know, it's a 3D game engine originally. It's about 10 years old. Now it's more of a content engine because it's being used to make much more than games, a lot of applications. I even saw a tutorial for project managers that was made with Unity, kind of a random one. But it's also being used to make a lot of VR experiences nowadays. And if you have any games on your phone whatsoever, there's something like a 70% chance that one of those games was made with Unity. It's 30% of the top 1,000 top grossing games, and we have games on more than 1.5 billion devices. And we support 28 different platforms, so that's everything from Xbox to iPhone to the new Nintendo Switch, which was just announced recently. You can just make a game or an app in Unity, and then you can just export it out straight out to any of these applications, which is part of the reasons it's so popular. It's just easy to use. You might recognize some of the games that have been made, Pokemon Go being the most famous, but this is a variety of the different games that have been made with using Unity. But Unity actually looks like this. It's a very complicated interface, 3D game engine. So you have your game view here, and then all of your game objects and materials and so on here. It was initially started in Copenhagen, and it now has over 1,200 employees in 24 countries. And before I came here, I checked. The closest one is in Odessa in the Ukraine. So it's really not that close to Lebanon, unfortunately. Most VR experiences, as I mentioned, are made or prototyped with Unity right now just because it's free initially to use. It's very accessible. It has a really good community, and a lot of different extensions have been made with it. You can download it on the asset store. Things like visual scripting if you don't know how to code. A lot of 3D models are available in the store as well. So I said I work at Unity on the Labs team, and I want to talk specifically about what we do on my team. So we focus on 3 key areas. The first is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence covers a lot of things. Obviously, it covers things like speech recognition and semantic analysis. That's a big one. Things like Watson, Cortana, Siri, obviously. These are good examples in the wild. But there's also things like smart, for Unity-specific things, there's things like start non-player characters, for example. Things like pathfinding, how do you get from point A to point B? And one of my personal favorites is 3D object recognition. So for example, if you have a dog, a model of a 3D dog, knowing that that's a dog, knowing that there are certain properties associated with the dog, or certain animations associated with it. So these are all things we're working on with artificial intelligence. And then we also have advanced graphics research. So this is also a couple of different key areas. The first is that we want things that are made with Unity to look very beautiful, right? Like obviously we want them to look as good as they can possibly look. But Unity is also a 3D real-time engine. It's a real-time rendering engine. Unlike, say, Pixar's RenderMan, which renders off-site and is usually much higher quality, but it takes forever to render. So our goal is to have the kind of graphics that you see in, say, like a Marvel movie, but rendered in real time. As the computers get faster, we can get faster and make everything look better. As for my team specifically, I focus on this part. Augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality, which is sort of a combination of augmented reality. I gotta be honest, I don't really like the term mixed reality. I feel like this is already long enough, but it keeps coming up. So, all right, so specifically talking about this, I'm gonna be talking about a couple different things. First, I'm gonna go through a brief history of AR, VR. I'll mostly be calling it VR because that's been around longer. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're specifically working on, pain points that we're trying to solve at Unity. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some tips I've learned over the last year and a half working directly in virtual reality and how people are coming up with best practices for the field. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about the history of digital realities, I guess, if you don't want to say all of this. Like I said, I'm going to use VR as a blanket term because it tends to apply to everything. Click. Oh, I'm clicking the wrong way. Oh no, now we have to go through the whole thing again. Ta-da! Oh, Keynote, so unforgiving. All right. So this is a picture of the guy from the 90s. I think this was from a BBC special about virtual reality and how it's the future. And remember how that didn't really happen at all? Like, this didn't really... Okay, so even in the 90s, actually, VR is kind of an old field. And I didn't realize that when I started working in it. It was pretty humbling. This is actually from the early 70s. This is one of the first VR headsets, and the first was actually in the late 60s. So yeah, that's a guy in the 70s, and this is a headset from the 90s that actually looks quite similar to Valve's Vive headset today. This is a woman not only wearing a headset, it's hard to see, but she also has a Wiimote kind of equivalent, which is something that Google's Daydream is shipping with like today. So this technology has been around for quite some time. This is one of my favorites. This is a slide from the 90s talking about how it's the product of 3 decades of work, which means that was like 50 years ago now that we've been working on this. Another kid in the 90s working on VR. And this is a really cool one. This is a woman in the 80s in virtual reality driving this underwater submarine. So this is the kind of tech that we've had around since the 80s. Okay. But since the 1990s, obviously VR didn't take off very much. But it's likely that some of you have been in VR, but maybe you didn't call it that. There's a very popular type of VR known as a cave. How many of you have heard of a cave environment before? No? Okay, that one. You. All right. Okay, so a cave looks like this. It doesn't have, you're not wearing a mask. The advantage is you can have multiple people in the same space all looking at the same thing, which is something you can't really easily do in VR right now. So you have a bunch of projectors, and you're using stereoscopy. The person wears 3D glasses, and they feel like they're actually in the space. Here's another example. This one has exterior projectors. And here's kind of what it looks like behind the scenes. And obviously, it looks pretty fake. You need to wear the glasses for it to really work. Here's a bunch of doctors all looking at it. Some of them have glasses on, and that one guy doesn't. I'm not sure why. All right, so here's a good example of this type of experience that I actually was just on last weekend because I went to Universal Studios in Los Angeles. How many of you guys have been to Universal Studios? A couple of you? Okay, yeah. All right, so this is the Harry Potter ride. You get on the ride like this. You're on one of these benches or magic benches. It's then put on this kind of crane-looking thing like this, which moves you all around the space. And then these cranes go around an environment with 3D projected images all the way around, basically like a really big cave, like I just showed you. And then you end up feeling like you're flying next to Harry Potter, and that's how it works. Universal actually has a lot of cave environment games. In fact, they've actually been criticized for going away from having robots like Disneyland does, for example. Like, for example, the Simpsons ride. This one is actually pretty fun, but you're just in a car looking up at a huge screen. And if you look behind you, you can see massive amounts of projectors. Okay, so this is an interactive, I was told this is an interactive talk, so I'm going to stop periodically to see if anyone has questions, but I'll also have time for questions at the end. So before I go on, does anyone want to clarify anything or anything? No. Okay, we're just getting started. Okay, so obviously this type of experience is a huge multi-million-dollar installation, and ordinary consumer versions of VR never really took off. Do you guys remember either one of these? One is newer. Virtual Boy and Google Glass, exactly, right. So Virtual Boy was a notorious flop back in the day. It only had 2 colors, red and black, so you went into a virtual reality hell no matter what game you were playing. And Google Glass was notoriously just before its time. How many people actually tried out the Google Glass? You tried it out, a few people. Was it annoying? Yeah, super annoying, right? No, right. So it relied on audio commands for one thing. So you were saying, okay, Google, okay, Google, okay, Google, you know, just kind of like Siri. The other thing is that it had a swipe input on the side. So you're constantly going like this when you're talking with people. Just not a really good experience overall. But that being said, okay, so the consumer side didn't work out that well, but as I was doing research actually into space and VR, I found out that there are places like NASA where they've been doing VR the whole time. This looks really silly, but they were actually working on VR headsets back in 1988. They had an LCD screen, and the resolution was 320 by 240 pixels. Sorry? Why did they bother? Yeah. Actually, that's a really good question. Why did they bother to do this at a time when the resolution was so low? I've been pondering best cases for VR for a little while now. Like, why would you want to use it? And the reason is, if it's cheaper to build a VR headset and better than what else you could do, then that's why you do it. So actually, I'll move right along. This is actually a current rig that they have. It's attached to something called the Charlotte robot. And the Charlotte robot was initially designed to be sort of a robot assistant on the ISS. But I'm not sure if they actually did that. But what they do have at the Johnson Space Center is this rig that emulates gravity. So they can go and do exterior, what are they called? Extracurricular spacewalks? Yeah, basically they just practice spacewalks, and this mimics not only the gravity but also the mass. If you're dealing with very large, heavy objects that have, very little weight, this is something you need to practice. So the other option would be just to have them go up into space and break stuff, right? So to your question, why bother to do this at all? Back before the tech was there, it was still cheaper and more efficient than any other option they had. I saw pictures where they were submerging spaceships in water. That only lasts for so long. So this was an alternative that they had for years and years before the consumer headsets came out. And there's another example. Honestly, it doesn't look super comfortable, but spaceships or spacesuits aren't comfortable either. So either way. And there's a final. This one you really get a sense of the pulleys and so on. Okay, so now I know actually that NASA is using the consumer headsets that are available today. I've seen pictures of them wearing Vives. So let's talk a little bit about the consumer side. Also, if you guys can't hear me very well, let me know. I'm trying to speak up, but go up, okay. So this is the high-end HMDs. How many of you have tried one of these? Not, just a couple, okay. Shout out, what did you try? Do you remember? Shooting games, drawing games? The Oculus, most of you tried the Oculus. With the gamepad, I'm guessing? Yeah, okay. So these are the highest of the high-end that you can get today. We'll talk about the controllers in a little bit, but they're both obviously quite expensive. The Rift with the touch controllers ends up costing about how much the Vive costs. Plus you need a really expensive computer to run them. Right now, Oculus says you can buy a computer for $1,000 USD. Honestly, I would not buy that computer because it's going to be outdated in about a year. So I did not add that wine glass in there, by the way. I got this picture from Forbes, and it just had a wine glass. All right. So next on the high-end HMD is the PlayStation VR, which actually just came out, and the new console hasn't even come out yet. So that'll be coming out, I think, in maybe like 3 weeks or so. It's $499 just for the kit, plus you also need the console. So again, you're looking at about $1,000. It has some disadvantages. The resolution is not as good as the other two headsets that I just mentioned, and neither is the tracking. And it just uses the Move controllers, which they've had for years. But the advantage is that you might already have the Move controllers. You probably already have a console, so it's a little bit cheaper if you already have these things, and it's really easy to set up. And from what I hear from people who have it in their house now, they actually really like it a lot. So there you go. So on the mid-range, then we have the Samsung Gear and Google Daydream. Daydream is not out. You can pre-order it now. The Gear has been out for about a year. Neither one of them come with fully tracked controllers. Daydream comes with one controller that is not fully tracked. And by fully tracked, I mean if I reach out and go like this, it knows what I'm doing and I can see my hand move in space. This only has 3 degrees of freedom, which means I can kind of go like this. It's very similar to the old Wii remote, if you guys ever tried that. If you look at a Daydream ad, by the way, you will notice that the activities they have are things like flipping pancakes, fishing. So look out for it, and I'd let you know. So for the Samsung Gear, it has a trackpad on the side, kind of like the Google Glass did, and you can also use Bluetooth controllers if they attach to your phone, but it's going to run out your battery on your phone, and you can't plug your phone in when it's in the headset, and they both require phones. So again, They're fairly cheap, but then you need a $700 device to run them. Okay, so let's talk about AR. On the high end, we have the HoloLens. Anybody tried out the HoloLens? Yeah, this one is a little bit more rare. It only has a dev kit available right now, and it costs $3,000, which is like quite pricey. The advantage of the HoloLens is that it is the highest end AR you can get that is not tethered. It's its own computer. And when they initially started making it, it used to get so hot they had to stick it in like a cooler to cool it down. So at least they fixed that. It still runs pretty hot though. There's also the Meta 2. I would say that's the closest front runner. The dev kit just came out a couple months ago, and it's, as you can see, quite much cheaper than the HoloLens. But it also requires wires, and it requires a high-end computer. There's one other thing I want to say about AR, because people ask me about AR a lot, and I do think that AR is genuinely the future. In the future, we're not going to be wearing scuba masks. We're going to be wearing glasses that are like this. But the field of view right now, aside from just the general, like, come on, this looks super nerdy, really, the field of view is really bad. So if you're wearing a HoloLens, you can see like this much of the screen. It's really not great. And for the Meta 2, it's a little bit better. It's a little bit more like that. But it means that if you're trying to look at something like a full-sized human, you can't see the whole thing unless you're really far away. You can only kind of see parts of them at a time. And that can be really frustrating depending on what it is you're trying to do. Okay, so these two are not great, but at least they're available right now. There's also Magic Leap. Have you guys heard of Magic Leap at all? They are a very secretive company that has taken $1 billion of funding and has no images, no documentation, no timeline, no SDK. They have like a very mysterious Twitter account, and I highly advise you go watch their TED Talk. It is two guys coming out on a stage in like a furry costume and an astronaut costume, and they play a song. That's their TED Talk. So again, they've taken $1 billion in funding, including from like Google. Google has given them, I think, like $500 million alone. So clearly, whatever they're making is inspiring. They're working with Weta, but as for what they're actually doing, no one knows, and no one will know for quite some time. So until I see something, I'm not sure. We're just all hoping that they come out and like kill it and don't mess it up. So for AR on the low end, no, there's nothing. That's it. That's all you got. Unless you count Pokemon Go as AR, there really is not anything out there for you. Or I guess Snapchat. Masks, yeah, not really AR. Okay, so why today? I know we don't have low-end AR, but we sure have low-end VR, and we have high-end AR. So why are they coming out today as opposed to the 90s? The first is that the mobile graphics community, or the mobile graphics industry, really powered the ability to have little glasses on that had fairly high resolution. Computers are just barely fast enough. So for really good VR, you need at least 90 frames a second. By comparison, your average game console runs at about 30 frames per second. Plus, you have to render it twice because you have one monitor per eye. So you need a really fast computer in order to render this really easily. And computers are like kind of just there. You can't do things like crazy particle systems. You can't have a ton of objects in a scene, or your computer performance will tank and you'll stop dropping frames, and when you do that, you get sick. But you can get there now. The resolution is also just barely high enough for people to not get sick. So right now the resolution is 1020 by 860, I think. Something like that for the high-end ones. Yeah, basically HD, but not 4K, right? So if you want to have an immersive experience, we've got like the bare bones now of what you need. Even for the Rift, even for the Vive, you can still see pixels, but it's enough to get you there. Yeah, the high quality 90 FPS is still a struggle, and 4K is frankly impossible. And I don't mean it's impossible like you just need enough computers and you could do it. I mean, sure you could, but even if you had enough computers to run it, you wouldn't have software capable of working across that many machines right now. So it's kind of this weird tag team where we need the machines and we need the software at the same time. It's heavy. Yeah, exactly. It's heavy and it's expensive. Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what is out there in terms of content. I didn't have time to actually come up with screenshots for everything, so I apologize in advance. But if you do get the chance to try out anything in VR, especially the high-end stuff, I recommend games like Budget Cuts, where you have killer robots and you sneak around corners throwing knives at them. Job Simulator, where you have to pretend you're in the future. Robots have taken over all of our jobs, so we have a bunch of simulation jobs where you pretend to be a chef. It's incredibly patronizing, really hilarious. Definitely recommend it. The Blue is a really great experience where you go under the ocean. It's not a game. You just hang out under the ocean with some fish, 100% gorgeous. Actually, I'm going to show you a little bit. This is actually Disney's app. It's actually not the best app. It's just a bunch of experiences and little tidbits they've come up with yet. But this is the opening screen, and it is honestly pretty cool just to be there. Just to be next to Star Wars and just to be next to the Magic Castle. Everywhere you look, you see a different view. And I also want to give a shout out to my personal favorite experience right now. There's a lot of things that you can do wrong when you're making VR. And this particular experience is called Gnomes and Goblins. The director is John Favreau. He's the guy who did the Iron Man movies, for example. And they've only put out a 5-minute demo so far, but it is 100% the most gorgeous thing I've seen in VR today. You can get it for free on Steam VR, so find that one friend you know who has a Rift or a Vive. Make them download it and check it out, because it is really, really magical. Okay, so a lot of the experiences that I just mentioned are made with Unity, my company's technology. And we've actually been in contact with a lot of the people that I just mentioned making experiences, and we even work with them sometimes on these projects. Obviously, they're working on cutting-edge stuff, and they need a lot of support. So what I work on is helping people make immersive content. And also, this is like a game from the 90s, by the way. You can barely tell, but that was early VR for you. Okay, so the big project that I'm working on is called Editor VR. We actually just announced this 2 days ago, so you guys are like the second to get a peek at this. Editor VR is taking Unity's functionality and sticking it directly in virtual reality. So I'm going to go through the nitty-gritty details, but I think a video might be a little bit easier for you to kind of figure out how it works. So you hit the Unity button down there, and then you get your main menu here. This is kind of the equivalent of a top bar in 2D. So then I'm going to open up the project view here. So this is basically the equivalent of a 2D window, and it's resizable. You can move it wherever you want, and you can take out objects you see, and you can move them around. This red line thing, this circular thing, is called a manipulator. This already exists in Unity and a lot of 3D programs. And we also put it in VR so you can move objects at a distance. And we also have something called the radial menu. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the functionality. You notice that things don't appear in the project view until we hover over them. That's because you might have something like 1,000 objects in that project view, and if we rendered them all at the same time and you had them in your scene, your computer would completely crash or start on fire. What? So some things are faster and some things are not. I'm going kind of slow here because this is an instructional video. I'll actually fast forward to the next one too. But actually, when it comes to things like, I just want to put stuff on a table, it's way faster to do it in VR because you already know how to do it. If you wanted to do it in Unity, you'd have to hold down a key, move things around, move things up and down, drag another thing out, move it around, look around. Have you used any 3D modeling tools before? Okay, so if you know them well and you're good at it, then yeah, you could probably do it as quickly. Well, maybe never that quickly. But if, for example, you don't want to learn a 3D program and you just want to get in VR and start laying out your scene, then this is the tool for you. And this is an example of a typing tool we came up with. So if you actually change the angle of it, it changes how it works. So when you hold it up, you type with the trigger, which is more precise. But if you turn it at an angle, you type like a drum, which is faster. We did this because we couldn't decide which one was better, so we just did both. Right now, I mean, honestly, when it comes to VR, there's no answers. So we're all just coming up with what to do with this together. And this is one of the first editing tools for professionals in VR that has ever been made. So this is something called the chessboard. And the things you saw before are in Unity now, but this is not. This is new. So this allows you to see where you are as a smaller view in the same scene. And this is useful if, for example, you want to do something like move this entire cabin. You could pick it up over there and move it, but you're moving it at the end of a ray, which can be really awkward or imprecise. But you could also just pick it up with your hand like a toy and move it where you want to move it. I think in this video, I might also do another one. Oh, you can move yourself, for example. So now I'm picking up myself and I'm moving myself to the back of the house, which is also useful if, for example, you just want to see the scene and move yourself quickly from there to there. You can also just point at the ground and teleport, but if you want to move yourself, say, like a mile, which you might want to do, it's easier to do it with a chessboard. You can also have two chessboards next to each other of different sizes, and this is basically the equivalent of having two different scene views in 2D, right? Like one zoomed in more, one zoomed in less. So you can just take objects and move them from here to here as well. Sorry? Yeah, I'm just kidding. Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So, right, you can just download Unity today, and all you need is a PC. You can run it. I have it on my MacBook Air, for example. But he was asking, do we need special hardware? The answer is yes. You need a high-end VR PC, and you need either the Rift or the Vive with the controllers, exactly. And the reason for that is that if you wanted to run this anyway, you need a high-end PC, and we assume that if you're doing VR development and you're in VR, then you have the VR equipment. So unfortunately, not everyone can use it right now. All right, one more thing. This is cool because this is not in Unity, and this is actually a third-party tool that someone made in about 2 weeks. So this is a quick animation tool. You see that they have a camera here and a screen. You can actually download this app right now today if you have it on SteamVR, but they put it in Unity directly. So if you hit record, it actually captures the motion of any object that you move. So I'm going to move this guy back and forth a bit. And you can see he moves on the screen. I'll give it a second. Do-do-do. So the cool part here is if I scrub back, I can see it on the screen. But I can also just see it. Am I going to hit play? No, not yet. Oh, I wish I could fast forward. I wonder if I can. Well, I'll just give it away. It actually just moves as well, so you can see both at the same time. The reason why we want to have technology, I'll get to you in just 1 second. The reason why we have technology like this is because a lot of the people who are making VR experiences are people like famous directors who have never used VR before, have never really used a 3D modeling tool before, and just want to get in there and tell you how to do it. So now we can have you do it, and you don't even have to be in the room, and things will just move. Sorry, question in the back?
Can you animate a rig with this?
Yes, you can add terrain. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Animate terrain? Yes.
A rig. An actual character rig.
Oh, no, but we were working with someone to hopefully get a rig in there. So I should say one thing about Unity. Unity is not a robust animation tool in and of itself. We do have some animations things, but we assume that you're probably going to be using another tool, a more specialized tool, and you use Unity to composite it. So us having tools like this is actually a pretty cool next step for VR. It's like very VR specific and doing more than Unity can do today, which is very cool. All right, let's see. What's this one? Oh yeah, and this is another example actually. This is a sculpting tool, which also can't be done in Unity today, but we had someone do a third-party version of a sign distance sculpting tool, so you can just do it directly in VR. And again, these guys do these very quickly, so if you're interested, if you do have a rig and you're interested in making a tool for Editor VR, I highly recommend you just jump in. We're going to have it available on December 15th for anyone to play with. So when this is done, it's just saved as a game object, and then you can animate that object. So again, for example, if what you want to do is just a really quick setup of your space in VR, right now that's very difficult. Tools like this make it really easy to do. And also you can see my amazing drawing skills. All right. So another reason we're doing this is because we kind of want to bridge the gap between what we see VR developers doing right now. If they're developing on a 2D screen, then they hit play, put on their headset, say like that's wrong, take off the headset, hit unplay, fix something, hit play again, put on the headset. So we want to avoid that. We feel like this is actually bridging the gap in the same way that Unity bridged the gap. So Unity basically lets you see your 3D objects, so you don't have to see code anymore. That's the entire point. So in the same way that Unity bridges the gap from code to the 3D object you're actually trying to animate or move, this takes that into VR, basically. And the other reason why we're doing this is we really do think this is the future of how people will make things, honestly. Like, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term. People will be able to create stuff natively in 3D. You'll be able to go home and, like, program that when your daughter moves a pillow, a dragon comes out of it. You know, like, this is the fun future that we anticipate will actually happen. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. How do we actually make the tools? How do we design this interface? So when we started working on Editor VR, we had these main ground rules. The first was what I described earlier, take off the headset less. We just want the developer or designer to be able to take off the headset and go. The second is that computers are really forgiving right now, especially for professional tools. So right now, if you're on a computer and you want to, say, copy something, you can hit, Control Copy or Apple Copy. You can go to Edit and hit Copy, or you can right-click and hit Copy. There's 3 different ways to do almost all of these actions. We wanted to replicate that for virtual reality so you can work as fast as you need to. We also wanted to have a very forgiving interface. A lot of the tracking that's available right now is not very precise. Honestly, it jitters a lot. If someone slams the door, the whole thing will shake. So I like to think of it as, if you're designing for computers, you can assume people have a mouse in a very small click target space. If you're designing for mobile, it has to be bigger to account for your finger. If it's like a huge iPad, it has to be bigger still. And then for VR, it has to be even bigger, plus you have to have the third dimension. Consistent Chrome, but not distracting. So that was kind of a big one we went back and forth on, because we didn't want to have something that was so fabulous looking that it messed up, the game or world that you were in, but also had to not look like the world that you're trying to make. And finally, everything is customizable. So everything that you saw here, you can make it any size, you can put it anywhere, you can lock it in position, and you can also actually just dive into the code. We're making it open source, so if you want to reskin the whole thing, you can. You can make tools for it, you can skin it, you can just do anything we want with it. Oh yeah, I forgot, I had animations for these. Okay. All right, so here's a little behind the scenes. This is about 2 years ago now when we first got our first Vive, and we were really, really excited, and we didn't have any space for it, so we set it up in the corner. And if you look over here, you can see that's one of the first cardboard prototypes we did of the inspector, because we wanted to see how big the text needed to be and how big the actual object should be. So this is what we were doing before we could actually just do it in VR. We just did it in cardboard. After that, we went to some really hideous mock-ups. This was in Cinema 4D. And we also did some variations where we thought maybe everything should be 3-dimensional, including the icons. But it turns out this really tanks performance, so we couldn't do it, basically. Or we thought the performance time would be better spent rendering the developer's objects instead of our objects. So here's some 2D mocks of the design that we decided to go for. We went with this sort of pane and frame motif. So you have a frame here, and this frame is always what you grab when you want to move things around or resize things. And then inside, everything is on a pane, which you can grab as well for things like scrolling. So that's the main menu, and then this was the original design for the chessboard, which you saw earlier. And then finally, here's the 2D version of the radio menu. And I want to talk about this one a second because I think it's really interesting. So the radio menu was made in part because we wanted the equivalent of shortcut keys. We wanted to have something where you could very quickly just cut, copy, paste, or whatever. So we made this design. The other thing is that, I'll get into this in a little bit, but the controllers for the Vive versus the Rift are very different in a lot of ways. So this is the outline of the touch controller for the Rift. And that's the outline of the Vive controller. And you can see that the only thing that they have in common is that they have kind of this big central round motif. So we decided to go with that, so it would mirror both and you'd be able to use both. This is a joystick, so you use a joystick to select objects. And then on the other side, this here is a thumb pad. So you just swipe to select the same things. We also assume a lot of developers are going to have both sets of hardware if you're really in the business and you want to make some money. So we wanted to make sure that you could pick up either controller and not feel like you were lost and had to relearn everything. So just to remind you, this is what the radial menu looks like in context. It only shows up when you're selecting an object. And then when you remove an object, it'll close back down. Okay, yeah, I already explained this a little bit, but the reason why it's shown twice here is to show the placement on both controllers. So let's talk about controllers for a second. The Oculus Rift, I mentioned this earlier, but it actually didn't ship with track controllers that tracked your hands. It only shipped with this gamepad, the Xbox controller. In December, I think, they're actually shipping these, which are the touch controllers. As I mentioned, they have the joystick, they have A, B, X, Y buttons, they have a home button, a menu button, and they have 2 triggers here. So that's what you've got for them. It's also a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter than the Vive controllers. And so for the Vive controllers, you have these terrible grips that no one ever notices or uses unless you tell them to. Bad design. A single trigger, and then the thumb pad, and then you've got your menu or settings button up here, and then the home button down there. So very different designs. And there are some mice on the market that are very different than other mice, but you can always assume that there's a primary click here and a secondary click here, or the reverse if you're left-handed. The same is not true for virtual reality design. You're dealing with some very different feeling controllers, and it can be a big pain in the butt. Oh, side note, I found that when you're demoing with people, it's actually much easier to tell them not to say click the trigger, but tell them to use which finger. So use your thumb versus use your finger. Honestly, I don't do this a lot because it sounds really patronizing to say that, but it seems like people just sort of intuitively map a verb to a finger movement as opposed to a button. Which is probably why in games they're always saying hit X to roll, or hit A to swipe your sword, because you instinctively want to just associate it with a finger instead. Okay, so to be clear, Editor VR only works with systems that have a PC. It won't work with the PlayStation, for example, because you can't run Unity on a PlayStation. I guess when you can run Unity on a PlayStation, you can also run Editor VR on a PlayStation. Let's see. Any questions so far, actually? Yes.
So I guess at this point you've spent a lot of time in VR.
Mm-hmm.
For someone who's a developer, like a Unity developer, who uses it for hours and every day, how long can you be in Editor VR before you get dizzy?
Yeah. So the question is, how long can you be in VR before you get dizzy? Which is a great question. If you have a crappy experience where you're dropping frame rates and your performance is bad, you can stay in about 2 minutes before you're like, no. If your computer freezes up, it's a very weird feeling, and a lot of people get instantly sick. I have noticed that I get less sick over time because I've been working in VR for so long. I would say the average person on a very high-end PC could probably last up to 2 hours before they just get sick of wearing a headset. And also straws are really handy if you're going to be doing a lot of VR work. Because if you want to take a drink of water, it's really awkward otherwise. Some people have been in there up to 12 hours. Some people don't get sick at all, like just never. One guy invented this app. It is the worst app ever. It makes you feel like you're drunk, like you're walking and the world starts moving. He's like the only guy in the world who can play this app, but he made it himself. I think that it's reasonable to expect new people to spend about half an hour to an hour. When I do demos and I have a limited amount of time, if I stop at 20 minutes, they're usually like, oh, I wish I could go longer. In about an hour, that's when they're all sweaty, taking off the headset, and then you have to get some cleaner and clean the whole thing off. But like I said, I do notice that I'm getting less sick over time. I can handle lower and lower frame rates. And I do have some coworkers who instantly get sick and will just never be able to do VR. And it doesn't seem to be related to age, and it doesn't seem to be related to gender. It's just I've got 2 male coworkers, and one woman I've met are like that, just into sick and they can't do it. So it varies, but an hour, yeah.
We've talked about art, but I have a question about sound design.
Oh, sound design. Yes, actually. Do I talk about? I talked about that a little bit, but yeah, I want to talk about that for a second because sound design is actually so much bigger in VR than it is for anything else. Presence is the term we use when you've really done VR well and you feel like you're in the experience. But I think outside of presence, sound design is really important for a number of reasons. The first is that sound does not exist in the real world outside of an action. So if I'm watching a movie, I can have a sound on a timeline and it's kind of designed to enhance what's happening in the scene, but it has no relationship to what's actually happening in the scene. But if I make a sound like this, it's because this is hitting something, right? And humans know that instinctively. So if you want someone to look somewhere in VR, I don't have arrows, don't have text. They're not going to read it or they won't notice it. Just go like this, and they'll instantly turn around. So sound design, I think, is 100% key. It can be used to fake haptic feedback as well. So for example, if you have something where you want someone to punch through a wall, giving a little shake of the controller, but also some significant audio cues will make you feel like you're doing that thing, much more so than trying to actually have like a real-life equivalent. So yeah, there's other examples of how great sound design is or how useful, but those are, I just want to say, it's very important. Keep it in mind. Sound designers are going to have Boomtown for VR. Actually talk about this a little bit at the bottom here. I was going to go into object selection now. So this is getting in the nitty-gritty of VR design. Basically, this is what people are doing and best practices that are emerging. So if you're in a scene and you need to have some objects that are selectable and some that aren't, which is almost any scene you're ever going to make, because if every object is selectable, then it has to have a collider, and then colliders are expensive. Again, you're going to tank performance. You need to make clear which objects are actually selectable. So you can have the object highlight when it's selectable by hovering over it. This works for things like editor VR. This is what we do because we want to make it really clear. It's less immersive if you're in a game and you don't want to have stuff just kind of turn blue, especially big things. That gets really annoying. So the other option is have the controller highlight when the object is selectable. One of the best experiences available for VR right now is made by Valve. You guys know Valve? Yeah, of course. Portal, right. And they're the ones who also make or co-make the Vive. So the lab experience that they came up with is hands down one of the best ones out there, and they have the controller highlight instead of the object highlight. And this makes, then instead of having your computer turn bright blue, the controller in your hand turns bright blue. Fair enough. You still get the idea. You can change the controller model. So, for example, if you're gripping something and you have a hand model, it can grip. Pinchers can pinch, This takes a lot more work. This means you need to have an animated, rigged model. So you need to do it yourself or have someone do it for you or download it on the asset store, but you have to have something do something. Controllers disappearing and become the object. I mentioned Job Simulator earlier, and they do this. So if I pick up the computer, then suddenly the model of my hand or the controller disappears. This is not as startling as it seems. In fact, almost no one ever notices it until you point it out. So if what you want is for people to be able to pick up something and really look at it, this is the option that you want, because then no controller model is in the way. It's actually a little bit better than real life, actually, because you can't do that with your hand. When you do selection, have haptic feedback, a little bit of vibration, not too much, especially if you pick up things a lot, because then it gets really annoying, just the way it does on a console game when you have too much feedback on your controller. And obviously, audio feedback is key. Just a ding or two, something to let people know that they're actually performing in the next action. I would really encourage you to think of any sort of user feedback as being more paramount in VR than it is for any sort of design you're doing today. Like, feedback is increasingly important, and animation has become a much bigger thing on both the web and on mobile. But for VR, it's that, like, cubed, basically. All right. So selection at distance. Everything that I just mentioned is mainly about just picking up stuff yourself and moving it about in the real world. But you actually do have to give people the option to pick up stuff at a distance sometimes. There are some problems with this. The first is it's kind of like picking up something at the edge of, like, say, like a fishing pole it gets really imprecise really quickly, right? And if your hand is shaky and the tracking isn't great, then it's just not a great experience. So how does it fit into your experience? And there's a lot of open questions about whether or not it works or not. I'm going to go through one of the problems with raycasting, which is that people feel like they think they should know how it works, like telekinesis. So I have a clip here from my least favorite of all the Star Wars movies. This is the fight between Yoda and the Emperor. And I want to just talk you through how it seems like you should be able to move things and then what you'd actually need to do to interact with the computer. Okay, so here we go. So we've got the Emperor, and he's in single select mode, 1, 2, like this. He selects a single object. Now he's group selecting. So he has a bunch of them, and he selects it all at the same time, and they're all coming down now at the same time. No word yet on whether they were like grouped together individually in there. Now he's back to single select mode, somehow without hitting a single button, using the Force OS. And now he's going to throw down 1, back to single select, and then Yoda is going to stop it, and then he's going to go into rotate mode, which somehow is also related to acceleration mode again, and then he's going to push it back at him. So this all seems really intuitive, but the fact is, if you wanted to select anything behind you and grab it and throw it at someone, you'd have to tell the computer exactly what you were grabbing, or you'd have to just sort of figure that you might not be grabbing the right thing. That's the reality working with computers today. If you close your eyes and grab a bunch of icons on the screen, who knows what you're going to come up with. So here's another example. This one's from a movie called Chronicle. How many of you guys have seen Chronicle? Yeah, a few. Yeah, good movie. I highly recommend it. This guy also has telekinesis. So he's going to do nothing. Okay, so that guy gets it back. What he just uses his thumb. Now he's going to go and whack. Now that guy gets hit. This is all just sort of brute force stuff, I guess. But he's using a variety of different gestures that all basically do the same thing. Push stuff forward. He opens the door. Now he kind of does nothing, and all the money is just going to magically float into his bag. That's a different mode, too. So again, just examples of how we think it should work. We think, oh, I should be able to just think the money should come. But without making a gesture or clicking a button or something, we can't work with computers. This is our reality today. So telekinesis. It's not that it's impossible. It's just that it's really, really difficult. If you really want to have gestures in your VR interface, and there are tools out there to let you do that today, and there are some that are becoming standards, like throwing your stuff over your shoulder to throw it away, just like really be ready to explain to everyone exactly how to do it very, very carefully. And also try to avoid gestures that are things that people would do normally. You don't want to have this be save or, God forbid, quit. And then people are like, hi, quit, over and over. So we're kind of punting on this, actually, by making the chessboard and letting you just move objects close to you at a distance. Then we avoid you having to move a mountain like so and trying to do it really precisely. So we're just kind of allowing you a couple different ways to do the same thing. Okay, so we've talked about the selection stuff. And you guys noticed at the end of the Chronicle clip, the guy was putting a bunch of money in his bag. So that's an inventory. So let's talk a little bit about inventory. This comes up more in games than other things, but it still comes up. Oh, I forgot. I actually wanted to talk about something else. Let's take a step back to raycasting. This is how they solve the problem in Unity. You can pick up objects and move them like this, but they basically have this object called a manipulator. So if I want to move an object in a straight line, I just grab one of these planes, or one of these axes in this case, or planes. And there's a couple of different ways of moving things. Sorry, this is pre-potato quality, but you get the idea. So you can translate things and rotate them. So this is a fairly standard way we use 3D programs to move objects in 3D space, but it doesn't feel quite as good when you're in VR and you feel like you should already know how to do it, basically. Okay, inventory. So if you have a bunch of stuff that you want to pick up and you want to put somewhere, again, this is a little bit more game related. I've seen some good examples. One is the diegetic backpack for one of the games that is pretty well known, Galleries of Six Elements. You actually just grab over your shoulder and a backpack appears, you put stuff in it, you put it back, and then it disappears. If you look behind you, you can't see the backpack, but it's always there. You can have metaphorical items, for example, if you want to stick something like in a wrist or hand, or when you rotate a certain way, then you can put objects there. This is sort of vaguely gesture-based, but it's also more pose-based. So if you're in a certain pose, then you're in inventory mode. You can just have a boring list view, or you could just have a bunch of cubes, really, if you just want a grid of objects that you could move. But then the question is always, like, how do you access this kind of thing? How do you make it accessible and put it away again? You saw in the earlier videos that for Editor VR, we just have a main menu, and it's always persistent. There's always that logo there. Kind of like if you have a Mac, there's always that apple in the corner. So we always give you a backtrack. But if you're making a game or other type of experience you want to have be more immersive, you might need to figure out another way of being able to access this kind of thing. Okay, so next up we have, not that. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. Next up is LOCOMOTION. LOCOMOTION is a really big challenge, obviously, for virtual reality because the likelihood of you being in the exact same space in VR and in real life is really, really small. So aside from just constraining you to a small room-sized space, which you can do, but that's very boring, here's a couple of different options people have come up with. The first is sticking your head in a bubble, which sounds ridiculous, but it is actually a lot of fun. It also has the advantage of letting you know where you're about to go before you actually go there. LOCOMOTION in VR can be really tricky for a few different reasons, but the first is that people don't like being moved outside of their own willpower in VR. Like if you have joystick locomotion or if you're in a car or a spaceship, you can get sick pretty quickly. The second is that if you move back and forth, it can cause lag in the OLED screens that are actually fueling your VR experience. So you want to avoid that as well. So any sort of yaw movement is more likely to make you sick than any sort of forward and back movement. So just sticking your head inside a bubble to go to another space is one easy way of actually feeling like you're going into another world. And that's been used to really good effect by Facebook in some of their social VR stuff. And again, Valve has used it too. You can shoot yourself places with a small circle. This is also known as blink locomotion. This one's pretty common. You just shoot at the ground where you want to go. Sometimes there's a room scale preview. People tend to like it. You usually have a little interstitial in between so people don't get sick. Right, okay, so that's shooting yourself with the room scale preview. You can use a good old joystick. It has problems. Only use it if you really need to. You can move to a place on something like a zip line that moves in a very straight and consistent trajectory. So Land's End is a game for Gear VR that uses this. It's only gaze-based selection, which we really haven't talked about, but basically you point at a thing with your head until it triggers an event. So what it does is you point at it like a dot, and then at a certain point it just starts to slowly move you forward. And if you do it slowly enough and consistently enough, then you can avoid sickness for the most part. Finally, you can just pick yourself up and move yourself around. This is what you can do in Editor VR with the chessboard. You just grab yourself wherever you are in the scene. This means you need to be able to see a smaller version of yourself. I guess you could grab your head, but that wouldn't take you very far. So these are basically, I would say, the best practices that are emerging so far around how to move yourself in a world that is larger than the physical space you're currently in. So basic commands is another big thing. This is less important for games, but much more important if you're trying to make any sort of professional tool like we are at Unity. Undo, cut, copy, paste, delete, save all. You saw what we did with the radial menu. It works well sometimes, but it also has some disadvantages. Like, for example, you have to make sure it's in your field of view, and the joystick and the thumb pad are still pretty tricky, so you have to be careful. You can't just quickly make swiping motions. Hotkeys are in short supply, honestly. You guys saw the controllers. There just aren't that many buttons. And you can use an alphanumeric keyboard, but then you can't step away from the desk, so that's limiting as well. So one thing I'd like you to consider is whether it would be worth it to create new types of metaphors rather than hotkeys. We've been talking about using gestures, but then if you need 11 different gestures just to do something like duplicate, is that really a good solution? Unknown. Audio commands are a really good solution, but you can't expect everyone making a VR game to ship with speech recognition and semantic analysis software. It's expensive, it's heavy, it might double the size of your app. So this needs to exist on the OS level, and it does. For example, Windows 10 ships with Cortana, which is the best speech recognition software out there today. One of our interns actually did a comparison this summer, and Cortana won hands down. So that's an option, but then you have to limit your users to people who have Windows 10. So right now, I'm just going to say it's not a solved problem, basically. But let's see, anything else? Yeah, so hopefully this will become a standard. This will exist. Oculus and Vive will support it as well. So to recap, there's no best practices yet, really. I've gone over some of the things that are just starting. We're still working on the basics of how to interact with things. And at Labs, we're watching and we're cataloging all of these systems. We actually have started a wiki of design practices that we're hoping to release fairly soon, so we'll have that available and open to the public as well. So today I've gone over a bit about the history of virtual reality, talked a little bit about what we're working on in my team, and then talked about the design practices. But I also do want to give you guys a chance to ask questions if you want to. So I'll just say thank you very much. And if you want, I'm Timoni on Twitter. It's always easy to reach me, and you can ask me questions there too. Do we have a microphone maybe for them? No? Okay, I'll just repeat your question. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, so the question is there a different interface for publishing for virtual reality? The answer is not really, actually. All you do is hit a checkbox that says it's VR enabled, and then you just push it out to Oculus or Vive or Gear, whatever it is you want to push it out to. We are redesigning our entire input system, though, not just for VR, but VR will make use of that. So, yep. Oh, so would the interface be different? Yeah, you need a 3D interface, if you don't have one already. So I would definitely recommend looking at it in VR first before you ship it. Yes? Connect, yeah. So any sort of 3D tracking software right now, like Kinect, HoloLens has its own version of Kinect, basically, which is why they're so far ahead. And we anticipate that Google Daydream, because their controller, honestly, is kind of shitty, we assume they're going to integrate with Tango pretty soon. The advantage there is obviously, it's a couple things. First, it's just being able to recognize actual objects in the scene. That's the AI stuff I'm really excited about earlier. So we'll know that this is a computer and then what you can do with the computer. The second thing is then you can do a lot more gestural stuff. The disadvantage, though, is everything I was saying earlier about gestures. So the HoloLens right now does have gestures to interact. It's terrible. It's really, you're like, this is close or click. So you're sitting there going like that, and then bloom is to open up the menu. It doesn't work particularly well. But I think for things like, say, motion capture, that's a really big one. If you want to like act out with people or have them interact with you, if you want something that can actually scan your body language as well as everyone else's, trigger-based stuff. Like so, if someone leaves the room, that would like start a new part of the experience that you're in. I think that there's like endless implications, but not so much on the gestural interaction stuff. Oh, sure. Yeah, yes, both. Her question was, is the user interaction limited to the hardware and software, or is it also limited to the logic of the world and the games? I would say both. So, for example, you can't point at the ground and move around in a gear game because you don't have tracked hands, so it doesn't know where you're pointing. So you couldn't do that there. But also, I've met people who don't want to have you blink locomoting around a space because they feel like it breaks immersion. If what they want is for you to be in a beautiful, tranquil forest, they don't want to have this weird, futuristic, like sci-fi interface, right, that you have to bring up in order to move around. So the limitations are both what the hardware is capable of, but then how you want people to feel or interact with your world. Does that answer your question? No answers yet. Yeah. I mean, I think some people are starting to internalize rules within themselves when they're making games, but I don't make games. I make the software for people to make games. So I'm like, do what you want. We'll help you do it. Whatever you want. Yes. Right. Yes, there is. That's a really good question. The question was, why doesn't VR usually have experiences where they represent your body? The answer is that we're not tracking enough of your body for it not to feel really weird. So some people do funny things, like my friend Max has an experience where you just kind of a dancing, moving thing. So then you look down and it's just kind of funny. But if what you want is to be able to move like this and have it be tracked, you can't get past the elbow before the IK starts getting really wonky. So your elbow's actually here, but it feels like your elbow, or you know, in the experience, your elbow is there. And it gets really annoying when you're trying to gesture to people and you can't do it effectively. It also feels strange if it's kind of moving your feet for you, and it will do its best to guess, but it's usually wrong. And then that also comes down to things like heights or weights or general sizes. You can kind of determine height from if you're using a Vive, because you know where the floor is and you know where the HMD is. But for the touch controllers, they come with this default set of hand models, and they're kind of like small and fat, and it really bugs me every time I look at them because it's annoying. So that's the main reason or two main reasons. The first is we can't track the body very well anyway, and secondly, half the time you're going to be looking down like, this is not my body. What's going on? So, yes. Go with it. Yeah, you can. So like in eValkyrie, you see your body and you're a pilot, and you can kind of go with that. The question is, can you just go with it? You're already in VR. I did play one experience called Asunder, where you start off in a prison and you're very sick and you have really long fingernails and your hands are kind of green. And I instantly was freaking out. Like my body was like, "You're sick. Stop moving." And I was like, no, I'm not. I can't even move these hands. It was an early DK2 experience. But yeah, it really hits some primal part of your. It gets pretty annoying quickly, and I think that's just a proprioception thing where we're used to what our bodies are, and when they don't look like that, it can be okay, say for Halloween, but if it's an actively different size or color or doing not what you're doing, it starts feeling bad, basically. So. Yes? Sorry, I can hear those guys better than you. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is Editor VR going to be a plugin? And the answer is yes, for a couple of reasons. First, it's still experimental because we're labs and we experiment. Secondly, because we're waiting on a new input system that isn't coming out entirely till next year. And the third is we want to open source it. So Unity is closed source, but Editor VR is open source, and we want to keep it that way. Anybody else? Oh. How about AR? Yeah, so we assume that a lot of the things we're learning are going to be applicable to AR. But since I showed you that the views in AR and the headsets are so small, we honestly don't think anyone's going to be using them for major world building or games or anything like that anytime soon. So as soon as the hardware gets there, we're going to be on it. We have them in the office. We support them. But we're not making anything major for them. Yeah, right. So actually, we are implementing Vuforia, but we don't make the standards. The hardware manufacturers do. We have our own API as well. But if what you want is like specific input types for the Vive controllers versus touch, they have their own APIs for each one of those. What we do have is like the new input system will allow you to assign behaviors to both triggers, for example, easily. Yes.
I know that sound design is very important in VR.
Yep.
But like Unity 3D sound, it just like makes the sound come from a place if you turn your head.
Yeah, Unity's.
But like sound does refract off things.
Yes.
Kind of
Yeah.
more complex than what actually 3D.
Yes. Unity's sound again, we assume you're going to be using like very complex tools to do this and then use Unity to compile everything together. I've seen some really great examples of spatial sound in Unity, not using Unity's system, but using external third-party ones. I would say like 3D sound design is fairly, it's not exactly new, but only recently is it becoming really, really important, and people often refer to it as one of the biggest pain points in the whole pipeline process right now. So, good luck.
Actually, we've been working with Unity for a long time now.
Oh, cool.
We developed a game for PFR,
Nice.
and now we're starting it for Vive. So,
Which game?
Hover.
What is it?
Hover.
Hover?
Yes.
Cool.
HOVR.
Okay. Hover. Everyone download Hover.
We have a schedule if you want to try it all.
Oh, cool. Okay, so just go out there and try it out? Nice.
Right next to Massive.
Cool. Okay. I just got off the plane and did a panel and came here, so I haven't got a chance to explore yet. So, all right. I think no more questions right now. Yeah. Again, if you do come up with one, Timoni at Twitter or Timoni at unity3.com if you want to email me, and I'll be around this weekend too. So, all right. Thanks very much, guys.